I want to talk about a story that is unbelievably depressing and actually made me physically sick. And when I say it made me physically sick, I mean I had to close the article multiple times because I felt physically sick, as in I wanted to throw up and read it. It was a report produced by the Kiev Independent, which shows the Russian army shooting with small arms, so not artillery, not mortars, but rifles and machine guns, at Ukrainian children, killing them by the dozens. And they show multiple instances across multiple regions of Ukraine of children being, in some instances, very deliberately shot by Russian soldiers and killed, and then, in at least one instance that they highlight, trying to cover it up or trying to say, well, that kid was a saboteur. And I think that what this article, I think, shows clearly to me, and this is something that other people who have been covering the war for a while have talked about, is a complete cultural disregard in the military for civilian casualties and a belief that the Russian army can get away with anything. The article says that the murder of Ukrainian children is systematic, and it's systematic because of the culture that the Russian army has developed, the type of behavior that they think that they can get away with. And I think when somebody hears the word systematic, they assume that there was an order from the top of the system to do this, therefore it was in the system. But that isn't necessarily true. A type of behavior can become systematic even if it isn't ordered on up from on high. For example, a systematic culture of corruption. That's something that isn't necessarily ordered by the president. Everybody be corrupt. But it could be cultural. That could be acceptable in either some government administration or throughout the ranks of some local government or regional government. And so I think that culturally, in the Russian military, actions like this, even if it's frowned upon by certain commanders and not openly approved by the Russian government, culturally, it is systematic. And I think they make a decent case for it. And we're going to go through a few of the instances that they highlight here. And we're only going to go through 3 because that's how many the article highlights. But there are other articles that also document children being killed by the Russian army. And I just want to say that this is just talking about Ukrainian children killed with small arms fire. We're not talking about children being killed by artillery, children being killed by mortars, drone strikes, jet, bombings, any of that. Caliber missiles, nothing. It's just small arms fire we're concentrating on here. Seeing the whites of somebody's eyes before you shoot them. Let's read. On a cold March morning, the Mahdyk family bundled themselves into their minivan. Their village near Kiev was occupied, and they couldn't bear staying any longer. The mother, Ola, father Valery, and their 2 children, 16-year-old Anna and 12-year-old Vladislav, decided to try to escape the horrors of Russian occupation and nearby fighting. We had enough of sleeping in the basement, recalls Anna. The family set off in their minivan to unoccupied territory on March 9, 2022, placing a sign on the widescreen reading "Children" in Russian. They thought it would protect them. On their way, the family ran into a Russian military convoy. They stopped, turned their car around, and began driving back. The Russian troops pursued them and opened fire. A single bullet hit the car, went through Anna's body, and killed her younger brother, 12-year-old Vladislav. I kept saying to him, "Get up, it's safe now." He wasn't answering. Vladislav is one of over 500 children who have been killed by the Russian army since the beginning of the full-scale invasion on February 24th, 2022. Now, these are the cases that they know of. I want to say a few things. First, I want to talk about that interaction there in a moment. But before that, I'm sorry, I said first I want to do that, but it's not first. Second, I want to do that. First, I want to say there are more children that have almost certainly died, but because a lot of, say, UN officials and other monitors cannot access occupied territory, it's very hard to document a lot of the civilian deaths in occupied territory where a lot of these things happened. And a lot of these things have only gotten revealed after these areas have been liberated. And so if the area isn't liberated, a lot of the graves have yet to be uncovered. Just like what happened in Izium, nobody could have expected or predicted that they were going to uncover the largest mass grave in Europe since the Yugoslav genocides, with over 440 bodies being found in that mass grave. Nobody could have expected that. So the 500 children, I just want to keep in perspective, is what they have confirmed. As for talking about this interaction, I do just want to quickly say that I heard somebody on Twitter trying to justify this by saying, but they ran away. They went to an area thinking it was unoccupied, saw the Russian army, and in their civilian car that was marked children, turned around once they saw soldiers, because they probably were like, oh, we don't want to be involved in any fighting. We thought the area was unoccupied, so we're leaving. That absolutely does not justify the Russian soldiers shooting upon a clear civilian car marked for children. This isn't the first time I've heard about children being killed, even though they were clearly marked as children, though. Everybody remembers the drama theater, which had children marked on it, the drama theater in Mariupol, before it was bombed, killing dozens to hundreds of civilians. The Kiev Independent documented 3 cases of deliberate murder of children committed by different Russian units in different parts of Ukraine. In one case, the unit commander was identified by name and rank. Alexandra Matvyuk, the head of the Center for Civil Liberties and one of the 2022 Nobel Peace Prize winners, sees the child murders as part of a deliberate terror policy pursued by the Russian army in Ukraine. She considers these war crimes to be part of Russian military culture. Russian troops have committed horrible crimes in Chechnya, Syria, Georgia, Mali, Libya, and elsewhere. They have never been punished. They believe they're allowed to do anything. This impunity, this long tradition of impunity, has become part of Russian culture. Here's one case. This is the one we were just reading about. After their car was shot, the family didn't immediately realize what happened. Anna was injured, and Vladislav was unconscious on her lap. The family returned home. Only then did they realize that he was dead. There was no time to process these events. They now had to save the wounded Anna. Her mother decided to take her to a hospital in a Russian-occupied town, Bucha. The father stayed with the body of his dead son. I'd already prepared myself for the worst, that I might die, Anna said. Before leaving, she gave her father her phone and told him to give it to her best friend, who was the only one who knew her password. On their way to the hospital, they were stopped at a Russian checkpoint by men from the Chechen warlord Razman Kadyrov's Akhmat battalion. The mother begged them to save her daughter. They agreed to provide medical assistance to Anna. Now listen to this. This is what made me close the article the first time I was reading it. They also turned it into a show, filming the whole process. Soon, a post appeared on Kadyrov's Telegram channel claiming that Anna and Vladislav had been shot by Ukrainian troops despite the area being fully controlled by Russia. The family rejects these allegations. There couldn't possibly have been any Ukrainians in the occupied territories who could have done this to us. Of course it was the Russians who did it. The Russians murder one child, heavily injure the other, and then after they tried to give medical attention to one of the not dead children that they killed, they then try to run a victory lap showing them as the saviors of the kids they went and brutalized. But isn't that a great demonstration of Russia's modern relationship with Ukraine? Or I think Russia's relationship with Ukraine, period. But especially Russia's modern relationship with Ukraine. Russia goes to Ukraine, brutalizes it terribly, and then brags, we rebuilt a building in Mariupol. We're saving the world from Ukraino-Nazis and terror after having flattened the entire city. What's that one SpongeBob meme? I can't believe I'm using this in this context. You know the one. Hey, Patrick, we saved the city. This is the most literal demonstration of this. Anyway, continuing. Shooting the incident. The murder of Vladislav is far from a standalone case. Murdering children is a systematic practice committed by Russian troops all over Ukraine. The Kiev Independent confirmed the deliberate murder of 10-year-old Katerina in the Kharkiv Oblast and 15-year-old I'm sorry I take a moment to do it right, but I'm gonna try my best because I think it's the least I can do. Myklano in the Kherson Oblast. On the first day of the full-scale invasion, the Kharkiv apartment building of Katyana. Wait, it's Katerina, I think. Yeah, it's Katerina. And her parents, Oksana and Artyom, was damaged by a Russian attack. Oksana and Artyom hurried to send their daughter to her maternal grandparents in the village of Buluk, about 60 kilometers east of the city. It seemed like a safer option. However, the village was quickly overrun by invading Russian troops. The very next day, Oksana received a call that her daughter was killed. "I was just starting my shift," Oksana, who works in a hospital, said. "My mom called me and said, 'Dear, I'm sorry, Katya is gone.'" The Russian military had entered the village on the morning of February 25th, the second day of the invasion. Later that day, the grandparents were driving with Katerina across the village. Suddenly, their car came under fire from Russian troops. A shabby red car with a child in the back seat. It couldn't have been mistaken for a non-civilian vehicle. After the attack, Katerina reached for her grandmother. She said, "Granny, look," and lifted her shirt. She said, bursting into tears. There was a tiny hole. One of the bullets had hit the girl. She was taken to a Russian military medic stationed with the troops in the village. He told them that they had 3 hours to get a child to the hospital. They then drove away. But the family never made it to the hospital. The next Russian military group they saw stopped the car and refused to let them pass. As the grandparents were begging to let the car through, the Russian troops came under fire from the flank and opened fire and returned, but at the civilian car. This time, bullets hit everyone in the car. The grandparents were injured, but Katerina was shot in the head. She died on the spot. The grandparents returned to the village to bury their granddaughter. A local resident told the Kiev Independent that the same Russian medic who treated her after the first attack told him that the girl was mortally wounded and didn't have a chance to survive. He said she had been shot in the liver. The blood was black. He said they wouldn't make it to the hospital on time, he recalled. So, not only is this an instance of them firing at the car, clearly civilian, has a child in the back seat, and they hit the kid, killing him. They then give that grandmother false hope, send her on an adventure that goes to another checkpoint that stops them, saying, "Please let me bring my injured daughter who has been shot, this little girl, to the hospital to get medical treatment." "No, you can't. We're stopping you," before riddling their car with bullets, killing her, putting a bullet in the head of the child. That's the second one. Here's the third one. This one's also particularly bad as well. Mikhail was 15 years old when he was gunned down by Russian soldiers in his home village in the southern Kherson Oblast. On April 15th, 2022, over a month after the village was occupied, he went to receive humanitarian aid distributed by the Russians. His friend, Anatoly, of the same age, went with him. On their way, the boys ran into Russian military vehicles and got scared. They turned back and started running away. Russian soldiers ran after them and started shooting. The whole scene was witnessed by a local resident. There were hundreds of those soldiers. They surrounded the territory and started shooting, and the two boys were running. They were basically being hunted, he told the Kiev Independent. The chase ended when he was hit and fell. Taran thought he was pretending, but when he turned his back, he realized his friend was dying. The Russian soldiers immediately took his body and drove away. 4 days passed before his parents found their son's body in a morgue in Novokakhovka, an occupied city 80 kilometers away from their village on the other side of the Dnieper River. According to locals, the Russians were visibly worried that the murder of a child could make the village rise against them. So in the first hours after the murder, they tried to justify it. There was talk of the boys taking photos of Russian troops before running away. When his phone was searched, there were no photos there. according to local citizens. So these are 3 different examples of children being shot with not artillery, not mortars, not, some bomb from some jet or launch from some submarine. This was small arms fire of these Russian soldiers consciously making decision to open fire on civilians on 3 different accounts. These are just the instances that the Kiev Independent decided to highlight. When you pump soldiers full of radical, reactionary, nationalist propaganda that the country they're invading doesn't exist, that the enemy they're fighting is one of the most evil enemies they could ever imagine. They're the Nazis. They're those who did the Holocaust and burned all these Slavic countries to the ground, including Ukraine, by the way, even though that's not usually talked about in this narrative. They are going to fight an enemy that plans to destroy Russia itself. An enemy that is not real. As in, not real that they're not existing, but that their culture is fake, their language is fake, their identity is fake, and they've been brainwashed. And then they turn on the Russian TV, and what do they see? Flatten the cities, destroy the cities, wipe them out. And after so much brutality in Syria, in Libya, in the Central African Republic, they've imported all that to here. They believe they can get really away with anything, that they're fighting a horrible, degenerate enemy that deserves what they're getting. Are we really surprised that they're behaving the way that they're behaving? They don't think they're going to be held to account. They hate their enemy, and they've been pumped up with all this nationalist propaganda. And it probably didn't help that they're being very poorly led. They're terribly disciplined. And many of them are just straight up murderers taken straight out of prison. This is systematic. It's cultural. It's the standard that the Russian army is holding itself to. This is the result. This story made my stomach churn. It was hard to read it. They also released a video, which I recommend you guys watch. It covers much of the same topics, but it's a good video. You should go share it. You should go like it. This is good reporting from the Kiev Independent, but this is not going to get much mention on CNN. This is not going to get much mention on MSNBC. This is not going to get much mention on NPR or any other station. Not only because it wasn't their journalists that broke the story, but also because, covering Ukraine is simply not as profitable as it used to be. The search algorithm does not favor you as much as it used to. You're not going to get as many viewers tuning in to hear updates about the war. And so more and more people have tuned out from the day-to-day coverage that was common during the early stages of the war. And because of that, a lot of this stuff is flying under the radar. A lot of the children getting murdered, with the reports just surfacing from either earlier in the war or more recent atrocities, are not being spread. This news is not being shared to the wider public. And I think if it was, and if we had consistent coverage of these types of atrocities, I think support for Ukraine would not be as divisive as an issue as many far-right Republican extremists are trying to make it. When we talk about freezing the contact line, either legalizing the occupation or trying to get some aesthetic solution that just feels good because you've stopped the fighting on the front line or stopped the war, at least momentarily, that leaves out the brutality of occupation. Not only your civil liberties being smashed, your property rights being taken away, you being deported, your children being taken from you, but also just this type of thuggish behavior being done towards the most vulnerable amongst your community. And then attempts to cover it up after the fact, as happened in Mariupol, as happened in one of the cases that we're talking about in this story, and has happened time and time again in both occupied and liberated territories. as in territories that were occupied and then liberated, and we then found the atrocities after the fact. When we talk about ending the war, we need to build a sustainable peace that doesn't just cause this war to happen again in 5 years. We have what we had from 2014 to 2022, just like a semi-frozen conflict with bombing every once in a while, and maybe, you know, it'll intensify a little bit, something that could easily spiral out of control into another war. But also, we need to do our best, our absolute best, to make it so that type of violence does not reign forever in occupied territory. And that's why Ukrainians care so much about liberation. Where is this article? It's with the Kiev Independent. Anyway, I don't really have anything else to say about this. I'm sorry if I'm not super eloquent on this story. But the story really, really angers me. Okay, that's enough of that. Sorry that was super depressing. The consequences are as predictable as they are horrifying. True, Sepson. Honestly, part of me refuses to believe that people are capable of committing this much evil. Sadly, they are. Sadly, they very much are. You know, human beings can be pushed to do and propagandized to do just the most horrific things. You can convince people to commit the worst of atrocities against their neighbors and sometimes even their own family members. Human beings have capacity for great, great good and great, great evil. You can do a lot of dastardly things with a blank canvas if you're raising them from birth under the state ideology of ultranationalism and hatred for any group.